Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and clicking on the bell for notifications. This is the channel to learn about literature and life. So what we're going to be doing today is looking through the context and also analyzing Henry David Thoreau's most famous essay, Resistance to Civil Government. This was first delivered as a speech twice in 1848. It was then revised and published in an anthology in 1849. And as it says there, I think that it's not too much of a stretch to say that this essay, which is sometimes referred to as Civil Disobedience, but the proper name is Resistance to Civil Government, that being because it's the title that he gave it, Resistance to Civil Government, was a play, sort of word play on one of the authors of his college textbooks, who he brings up within the first couple pages of the speech and essay. So that's the proper title, not Civil Disobedience, although that's a fine title too. And as it says, I think it's one of the most important essays on political philosophy ever written in English. So let's dive right into this. This essay, of course, is part of our unit that we're studying on transcendentalism. We've already discussed the definition for that earlier. A philosophy derived from Romanticism that flourished in the Northeast United States in the early 19th century. Emerson and Thoreau were championing and articulating this philosophy, which contends that the individual mind has the capability to transcend the human institutions that seek to fetter it. And as I mentioned in class, and also, of course, if you're a student, you're watching this, and it's going to be part of the final exam, and if you're just someone who is not one of my students, but you found this on YouTube, it'll be a great standalone video. Also, if you want to, you can look at the previous video from a few years ago, in which I gave an introduction to transcendentalism through the writings of Emerson. So those two things fit very nicely together. Some of the same language that I used in both of those in that previous video. And both in class and perhaps also in the earlier YouTube video about Emerson, I said transcendentalism, I kind of wanted to, what I enjoy doing is, in class this semester, fall 2024, we've been looking at transcendental writing now for 2 weeks with Emerson and Thoreau. And I want to just kind of leave that blank for a second more, and then we'll look at it and we'll give a final definition to it after we finish looking at this essay. So, great. So let's dive into basically I'm going to be talking a little bit about the historical context, and there's two main things that we're kind of thinking about, because of course this isn't just a literary essay, this is a political essay given as a political speech. With particular political ends in mind. It's so beautifully done, and it has such intelligence and such lasting value that it comes to be one of the best political essays ever written, just period. But of course, there were a couple things that he was, seeking to change people's minds about in 1848 and in 1849, then when it was published as well, too. So the couple of things that we need to understand about the historical context, just in general, two things. Number one, the great westward expansion of the United States in the early 1800s. And then secondly, and more close to the date of the composition and publication of the essay, is the Mexican-American War. So we'll look a little bit more intensely at the Mexican-American War in just a moment, and I'll be really brief with this. These are things which I've already talked about in class. So 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, which is, of course, this huge chunk of land that the United States acquires. And that is basically, if you think of, there's the Mississippi River, almost, right down in the halfway point in some ways of the United States. And then the Louisiana Purchase, just as a quick reminder, everybody learns this in high school, I'm sure, that is the area that's west of the Mississippi. Basically, you can think of it as the area that is drained by the Missouri and the Mississippi River on the west side of it. So then going up from, Louisiana, obviously, present-day Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas, I believe, Kansas, Montana. So The War of 1812, we already talked about in class, and actually, if you needed to learn more about that, that's also on the Emerson video as well, too. So let me just skip that. 1815, the beginning of the market revolution in the North. So this is just important because these are the several decades preceding Thoreau giving this speech, and also basically this is linked so much to the idea of westward expansion. What is the market revolution? Well, it's capitalism, and it's just the market revolution, the transportation revolution of the 1820s, 1830s with canals and railroads. This is all just part of the Industrial Revolution in Western civilization in general. With the market revolution, it's really a rethinking about who should be working, how people are working. People are leaving farms. There are even women working in factories then in the 1840s and 1850s. One of the most important things for understanding the Industrial Revolution in America in the first half of the 19th century is actually understanding that transportation changed so much. So we're talking about the 1820s, 1830s, as it says there. The Erie Canal was finished in 1825. The reason I'm just going to point that out is, so for example, in 1815, let's say you're wanting to move some kind of commercial goods from, say, Cincinnati to New York City. The year is 1815. Well, it's really difficult, really expensive to do that. As a matter of fact, in the year 1815, if you wanted to move things from Cincinnati to New York City, the cheapest way to do that would be to you'd probably move it down the Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans, then load it on ships in New Orleans and take it, through the Gulf, around Florida, and then up along the Atlantic seaboard to New York City. That's actually the cheapest way to move things from Cincinnati to New York City in 1815 because it's before railroads and canals. Well, that changes, slowly at first, but then pretty rapidly. The Erie Canal being probably the most important occurrence of this transportation revolution, or the first early occurrence. And just so we're clear, so the Erie Canal, what is it? Well, that's the man-made canal going from Buffalo, New York, straight east to Albany. And why was it so important? Because then you could float things on barges from the Great Lakes straight through the canal to Albany, boom, down the Hudson River to New York City. So it's the first of many, many canals which just revolutionized transportation all through, mostly in the North. Then, of course, in the 1830s, there are the railroads. America takes to railroads like no other country on earth. I want to say that by the year 1860, just before the beginning of the Civil War, I believe I've read that the United States has more miles of railroad track by 1860 than all other countries in the world combined. So the market revolution, the expansion of transportation, all of that is really important, kind of leading up to, this time period, the expansion of the country, and what Thoreau is worried about and what Thoreau is addressing in this essay. And then the last thing there is the Great Awakening. And so let's take a minute to talk about that. So the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, I already lectured a little bit about the First Great Awakening, not only in class, but also elsewhere on this channel. If you wanted to read about it, listen to it, the First Great Awakening I described in an earlier video entitled Phyllis Wheatley and Evangelical Christianity. The First Great Awakening is in the early 1700s, and it's a series of revivals, many, many revivals, and it's a change from the sort of Calvinist worldview of many of the Christians that had come to Massachusetts in the 1600s. The Great Awakening is a shift away from that Calvinism to what would now be like early mainstream Protestantism. So that's one part of the First Great Awakening in the 1700s. The other is, although it may sound a little silly or even reductionist, but it's when emotion is really becoming a component in American Christianity. So the idea of fire and brimstone preachers, also just the idea of that you should be feeling, well, to put it in the words of a Christian minister like Jonathan Edwards, you should be feeling Christ in your heart. So that's the first Great Awakening in the early 1700s. The Second Great Awakening is, again, another series of revivals and increased membership in Christian churches and Protestant Christian churches. And what is different about the Second Great Awakening is it's really Christians thinking about how do they apply their Christianity out in the world. So, and so some of the things which I've listed right there, the temperance movement, which is really important because, frankly, the level of alcoholism in the 19th century in America is enormous. Americans drink a lot of whiskey. They drink a lot of alcohol. And so alcoholism was just rampant. And so if you ever wondered, why was there a temperance movement? Why did we prohibit the sale of alcohol for a decade in this country? Well, it's because it was the only reaction that, Americans could think of to the rampant alcoholism. And, was it very Christian? Yes, of course it was very Christian. Christians were the ones who were, forwarding the idea. It was probably, for all they could do in the 1800s, it was probably a good movement in some ways. Not because I, want alcohol to be illegal, but because there wasn't anything like a 12-step program or AA, any of the things that we understand now from just psychology and the psychology of addiction. That's far beyond the, ideas of anybody in the 1800s. So the temperance movement was probably a good thing in some ways. Definitely abolitionism and later women's rights. They're growing out of the Second Great Awakening, and it may be a little bit of a surprise that women's rights are growing out of a Christian movement. But really, many of the, I would even say most of the early women's rights advocates, women themselves, were often people, they were educated young women, they were devout Christians, maybe they were like Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, maybe they were the the daughter of a famous minister, which she was, Lyman Beecher. But they were often women who were daughters of ministers, married to ministers, and that was Christianity had a strong influence in the, the beginning and a catalyst to women's rights, surprisingly. Not everybody, of course, who was a women's rights advocate was a Christian, but many, many, many were. And then finally there it says utopian communities, and that may sound a little bizarre, odd, but for whatever reason in the 1830s, 1840s, there were many, partly because of the market revolution, increased the standard of living dramatically in these few decades, increased the standard of living for, people in the North, especially dramatically. There were all kinds of interesting, original, and unusual attempts at socialist communities, at Christian utopian communities. These are times when the Shakers, the Oneida community, you could even, I don't think it would be proper to call it a utopian community, but there's all kinds of different progressions of different versions of Christianity, spirituality, the beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons come out of this time. Anyway, so those are just some of the things which the Second Great Awakening helped to catalyze. Okay, great. So we do need to talk a little bit more about history now. This, PowerPoint screen is just loaded with things, and this is the last bit of history that we need to look at before we actually start in on the on looking at key passages and understanding, resistance to civil government. So this is basically all about Mexico, Texas, and America, and the interrelationship between the three of them. Okay, so as I'm sure everybody knows, Spain and Portugal colonized parts of North, Central, and South America for a couple of centuries before this. 1810 to 1821 is the, as it says, long and complicated Mexican independence from Spain, which I won't go into at all. We don't need to look at it. But in 1821, Mexico becomes its own country, independent from Spain in 1821. And now we're going to be looking at and focusing on basically on Texas here. So in 1821, this new state of Mexico, newly independent from Spain, the new state of Mexico is much larger. It's about twice the size of present-day Mexico. In 1821, it included all of what is now Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, all of California, all of Utah, I think, and then even most of Colorado. So Mexico, the country, the new country in 1821, is pretty large. In the 1820s, as it says in bullet point 2, Stephen F. Austin, this American who was born in southwestern Virginia, brings hundreds of families to what is now present-day Texas. The Mexican government originally thought it was a good idea that all these Americans were coming there. The area that we call Texas now didn't have a high population at first, nor did California at that point, which is Mexican territory as well. And so the Mexican government originally thought it'd be a great idea if all these Americans would come, but they still considered it part of Mexico. Well, so now you've got all these people from America, many of them bringing slaves to what is present-day Texas, or what is present-day Texas and Mexico. And I'm down to the third bullet point. Well, at this point in the late 1820s, Mexico frees all of its slaves. And in addition to outlawing slavery in Mexico, it also mandates the support of Catholicism. Well, neither of these things sit well at all with Austin or with all these literally hundreds of American families, many of whom had brought slaves with them. This doesn't sit well with them all. So by this point in 1829, in the early 1830s, there is beginning to be a growing resentment toward these Americans living in what is the Republic of Mexico. Well, actually, the Republic of Mexico in 1834 basically ends because they had a federal system, and General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna comes to power in 1834 and basically installs himself as a dictator in 1834. So General Santa Anna, the dictator and leader of the Mexican army, comes into power in 1834. Again, these Americans living in what is then Mexico, this makes them nervous. They're also, besides not wanting to be Catholics, not wanting to free their slaves, they're also not wanting to obey Mexican tariffs and taxes. So there's this growing hostility, and then just over there it says 1836, the Alamo, Goliad, Sam Houston. Those are all three separate things, but basically this the hostile feelings between these Americans living in Texas and General Santa Anna reaches, the culmination of war in 1836. We might actually talk about the Alamo and Goliad a little bit more. Those are obviously massacres of Americans in Texas by Santa Anna's troops, both of those, the Alamo and the Goliad. This is all in the spring of 1836, and we might talk about them a little bit. Actually, in the next author that we get to in class, Whitman, in his great poem, Song of Myself, he brings those things up, and he actually sort of goes into and describes especially Goliad and talks about the hundreds of people who were executed and murdered. And he does it in this really beautiful and sad way. It's sort of about midway or 2/3 of the way through the poem. Anyway, so we're in 1836. Santa Anna's troops have slaughtered not technically Americans. They're Americans, but they're living in Mexico. In the Alamo, in Goliad, Sam Houston is the general of the largest army, the largest American army there in Texas. And he basically, he's going to defeat Santa Anna, and it's remarkable that he does because Santa Anna has outnumbered him. And Houston is taking his troops, and he's always kind of running from them. And it looks like maybe he's going to just, evacuate, take all of his troops and evacuate and, leave the Mexican territory completely, maybe go to New Orleans or something like that. But what he's doing is he's playing a little cat and mouse until finally he catches General Santa Anna and his troops off guard. I think the battle actually is right beside a river in Texas. And basically, Santa Anna and his troops it's in the afternoon. They're at this little bend in the river where there's water on three sides of them. And Houston waits until the afternoon when he thinks that the Mexican troops are going to be literally napping, taking a siesta. Houston's got these spies in the trees. And anyway, just out of nowhere, Houston, who's been running from Santa Anna and his Mexican soldiers, then Houston turns and pins them. And in the course of, I think it's a short battle of an hour or two, and it's hard to believe the numbers, but Houston and the American troops kill, I think, over 600 Mexicans, take another 600 or 700 prisoner, and lose less than 10 American lives. It's crazy to believe this. But anyway, so Houston defeats Santa Anna, surprisingly, and forces General Santa Anna to concede this area that we now call Texas to him as an independent nation. So then, as it says in 1836 to 1846, Texas is its own independent republic. It's no longer a part of Mexico. Houston and most of these other families wanted and assumed that they would eventually be annexed by the United States of America. And it took a little bit longer, but during that whole, decade that Texas is its own independent nation, there are more and more Americans moving there. So anyway, that takes us up to 1845. And then that phrase manifest destiny, which everyone has heard. What does it mean specifically? It was probably coined in a newspaper article in 1845 by a writer named John L. O'Sullivan. And manifest destiny, I think I don't have memorized the phrase that he used, but basically what he was describing was that it was the manifest destiny of the United States of America to acquire territory stretching all the way to California, from sea to shining sea. That was it's such a poetic phrase, which is why it stuck. It's the destiny, it's the fate of the United States in 1845 to expand, all the way to Mexico and to acquire the territory that was Texas, was Mexican, and in the Northwest, that was the Oregon Territory, which at that time was disputed between the United States and Great Britain. And, well, actually, all that comes to pass in just a few years. So anyway, that's what manifest destiny means. It's just that phrase that means the United States should move westward and expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, what I described with Sam Houston in 1836 and Santa Anna, that was just a relatively small number of battles that only took place right there in Texas. And technically, those were people who were living in Mexico. They weren't really American citizens anymore because they'd been living in Mexico. And so that's not the Mexican-American War in 1836. However, this idea now in 1845 has been brewing for literally decades. Literally decades by 1845, the idea that America should expand. Most Americans agreed with this idea. Not all, but most. However, the problem was many Northerners thought, yes, the United States should expand all the, territory going all the way out to California. That should all be the United States of America. But most Northerners, although they agreed with that, many of them wanted those new lands to not be slave-owning states. And of course, most Southerners wanted to expand, but they wanted to have, an expansion of slavery into new states as well. So, so in 1846, basically I think there was a presidential election in 1844, President Polk, and he made one of his, main platforms the idea of this manifest destiny. And after he was elected in 1844, then he brought troops right up to the Mexican border. And so he basically provoked Mexican troops to attack Americans in 1846. So 1846, the president gets what he wants, which is a border skirmish with Mexico, and that results in an all-out war. It's so there's an all-out war. Then it says there at the bottom, Mexican-American War, 1846 to 48, and it doesn't last that long. I think by maybe September of 1847, American troops are already all the way down to Mexico City and in control of Mexico City. So again, that's 1847. We're still at war for several months because even though American troops control literally the capital of Mexico City, even though American troops control that, it takes a while to negotiate some sort of peace treaty and to figure out how to, force Mexico to cede all that land, which they eventually do, in less than a year after that. And so then, as it says there at the very bottom of this, and so we're done with this slide, the result is a huge increase in American territory. So to be clear, America wins the Mexican-American War in 1848. The result is this huge increase in American territory. And as it says, that's all of present-day Southwest USA. So then that's all of Texas and, New Mexico, Arizona, all of California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado. Boom. So all of that comes in. And I think in the same year or maybe a year before, but right around there, by 1849, we've also got control of, what was called the Oregon Territory, which was really 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So, okay, great. So those are and we need to understand that to understand why Thoreau is upset about the Mexican-American War. So here we go. Okay, and now here what we've got is just a couple of contexts of Thoreau, the context around him writing and giving the speech, etc. So, in 1845, from 1845 to 1847, these 2 years and 2 months, he's living at Walden Pond in his little homemade shack, which is, of course, described in his book Walden, which we just read chapter 2 of in class. So it's right in the middle of this 2-year time period that he is arrested in July of 1846 for failure to pay poll tax, described in the essay. Then in January and February of 1848, this essay that we're looking at right now, we'll get into the looking at the significant passages. He delivers this as a speech twice, revises it, publishes it in 1849. And then I'm gonna come up with a stronger thesis in just a moment, but basically, we can say that the thesis here concerns the conscience of the individual over the state, and then he calls for an immediate end to slavery and the war with Mexico. So now we're going to look at some passages in the essay itself, and just to kind of quickly go through them. At the very bottom, you'll see it says first and last paragraphs. So this is very much a literary essay in addition to being a political speech. And so the very first two or three sentences, he's going to echo and bookend that same little idea about what a perfect and glorious state could be, free of all government. Eventually, it's really beautiful. It's like he's imagining something that could be in the future. Who knows if human beings could ever live in a way where we've evolved enough, morally and ethically and spiritually that we could live with no government. It's possible. Anyway, so that's the very beginning and the very end. In the first few pages, page 904, he's going to discuss the importance of the individual conscience. Then the next two items that I've got there, he goes into some metaphors about government and friction and taking a plank from a drowning man. So they're really important metaphors that he uses, very poetic, very powerful. And they are a little challenging when you read them because Thoreau's vocabulary is high and he's very intelligent. So it's almost a little bit challenging just to kind of understand what he's saying. So we'll go through that and make sure that you do understand it. Thoreau's, he's upset with abolitionists who don't act. And in many other places, we'll just see that, you can tell that this was written as a speech. He describes his prison experience. And then kind of towards the end, the last page, he makes some remarks about the Bible and the Constitution, beautiful remarks about how wonderful they are as documents, but how we can also search for a purer truth that informs and perhaps created the Bible and the Constitution. So we will begin looking at those things right now. Okay, so again, this the very beginning of this essay is going to introduce this kind of little beautiful idea that he'll touch on again in the very final paragraph. So, I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more quickly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe. That government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. So, we'll see that he touches on that at the very end of this essay, and we'll just give you a quick little preview of that now. He says, and it gets really beautiful. So he's at the end, he's made his arguments. He's also brought up these different spiritual ideas throughout the essay. He's talked about his time in prison. And then he says, there will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly. He goes on to say that he imagines this kind of, and now he's making a pun on the word state, which state obviously refers to government in general, the state, but it also refers to, a mental or spiritual mode of being a human. What kind of a state are you in? What kind of a mental state? So he's consciously playing off that. I please myself with imagining a state at last which can afford to be just to all men and treat the individual with respect, which even would not think it inconsistent with its own repose if a few were to live aloof from it, not meddling with the state, nor embraced by it, but who fulfilled all the duties of neighbors and fellow men, a state which bore this kind of fruit. So a government or a mental attitude which bears this kind of fruit and suffered it to drop off as fast as it ripened would prepare the way for a still more perfect and glorious state, which also I have imagined but not yet anywhere seen. So I skipped ahead there just to show you that the beginning and the ending, he's touching on the exact same theme, this idea that eventually human beings could get to such a, quote, state that we don't even need government at all. So, okay, now let's go back up and we'll look at a couple of the passages early on which give us, which first of all are transcendental ideas and that which then give us the thesis of this. So, here we go. So this is probably page 904 in your textbooks. Can there not be a government in which majorities do not virtually decide right and wrong, but conscience, in which majorities decide only those questions to which the rule of expediency is applicable? Must the citizen ever for a moment or in the least degree resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that so again, you can tell that he's writing it as a speech right here. I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. So the idea being there, just reduce it to that the primacy, the prime thing is for the individual's conscience, not for a respect to the state. Okay, good. Now, he is now going to talk about why he's calling for a revolution, because he's calling for a dissolution of government in general. And so you might ask, well, is it really that bad? So he says, all men recognize the right of revolution, that is, the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. And so then he goes on to say that in the Revolution, the American Revolution of 1775 and 76, the people there, the British subjects in America, at the Boston Tea Party, etc., they thought that the government had enough problems, had enough friction, had enough bad policy, just with taxation, that alone was reason enough to have a revolution. So he's just stating that's a fact. Now he says in this really amazing little metaphor now highlighted here, all machines have their friction, and possibly this does enough good to counterbalance the evil. At any rate, it is a great evil to make a stir about it. But when the friction comes to have its own machine, and oppression and robbery are organized, I say, let us not have such a machine any longer. So what is this? And if we were live in class, what I would do is I would say, okay, so students, what is this metaphor? He's saying there's machines and there's frictions, and that's a metaphor for something. What is it? And usually there's a little bit of a struggle to really place it, but it's clear. So the machine is his metaphor for government. Any government anywhere, in any time or place or civilization. Machine is a government. It's doing something for us, right? And then, so what is the friction? He says all machines, all governments have their friction. And so basically saying so it's just a fact. So what is the friction? The friction is, and again, I would ask you this in class. I'd sort of make you, verbalize this. What does friction mean? Well, it means bad policies. So it doesn't matter if it's, 1848 when he's first giving this as a speech, or now in 2024, we all know for a fact that no matter what government a person has, no matter who is in power, whether it's the Democrats or Republican, all governments sometimes have bad policies, and he's calling this friction. It slows down the machine. And now he's saying that the friction, the bad policies, are so terrible in the 1840s that we need to dissolve the government. Let us not have the machine any longer. Great. Now then he says down here, but Paley appears never to have contemplated. The person he's referring to is, this is why Thoreau is kind of so brilliant and self-confident in his writing. He's referring to a guy named William Paley, who's an English theologian, and who in fact had written a textbook that Thoreau had used when he was in college at Harvard. And so he's literally he's kind of picking fault with one of his college textbooks. So this man Paley had written it. Paley appears never to have contemplated those cases to which the rule of expediency does not apply, in which a people as well as an individual must do justice cost what it may. So then he goes on to say with another metaphor, if I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself. And so the question is here, so what is this metaphor, this new metaphor? If I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, even if it were to cause me to drown myself. Well, that makes sense morally, doesn't it? This, according to Paley, would be inconvenient, but he that would save his life in such a case shall lose it. So what he's saying right here is if we don't give other people their right to life and liberty, if we steal it from them and take it from them, then we're giving up our own moral life as well. We're giving up, maybe he would say, the immortality of our soul. And then he says really clearly, this people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico, though it cost them their existence. And so why is he saying that? He's saying because, to be clear, the drowning man, that metaphor is a slave, and then the plank is freedom. And so what he's saying in this passage is Americans, white Americans, have taken the life, taken the liberty of black Americans, of enslaved Americans, and have taken it from them. And the argument at the time in the 1840s, even among people who disliked slavery. There were plenty of Northerners who disliked the idea of who disliked slavery, but didn't feel like it was a really important political issue because they were convinced that it would hurt the economy, especially the Southern economy, but all of the economy of the United States, in order to abolish slavery. And in fact, the truth of the matter is that the Southern economy was founded by that point and centered almost exclusively on cotton and slavery. And it was a really lopsided economy. Almost all of the manufacturing took place in the North. And in fact, I'm not positive about this, I think that when the Civil War broke out, there wasn't a single munitions factory in the South, which is kind of a bad way to start the Civil War if you're a Southerner without even having a single factory for making guns or ammunitions. But anyway, so you get what he's saying here is that he's saying even if it costs us economic catastrophe, we've got to get rid of slavery. Good. This, I think, is amusing, this little part right here in the middle of the page. He's quoting, I believe, an English playwright, maybe from the early 1600s. This little bit of poetry here. A drab of state, a cloth, a silver slut, to have her train borne up and her soul trail in the dirt. And so I always get a kick out of talking about this in class, because then I say, okay, people, those of you who read this, who did a nice job of reading it, who's the slut? What's he saying here with this weird little quotation? A drab estate, a cloth, a silver slut, to have her train borne up and her soul trail in the dirt. And then he answers it right away. He says, practically speaking, the opponents to a reform in Massachusetts are not 100,000 politicians at the South, but 100,000 merchants and farmers here in the North who are more interested in commerce than they are in humanity. And they are not prepared to do justice to the slave or to Mexico, cost what it may. So the slut there in his little, in that little passages, he's saying that's Northerners who are not willing to pay the economic price to stop war with Mexico and to abolish slavery. And I might say, by the way, so it's clear, in a couple of passages that, so again, the overall thesis for this is going to be, number one, that a person's individual conscience is more important than their, subjection or allegiance to the state. That's one thing. And the second is to immediately end the war with Mexico, which is already ending, really, when he gives it a speech the second time, and to end slavery. Just to be clear, I mentioned this when I was talking about the Mexican-American War, but I want to be clear. Most Americans disagreed with him on the Mexican-American War. They were okay with it happening, and we won fairly quickly, and the result of it was a huge acquisition of new land. There were a few people like him who thought, well, this extra land is it could be slave, it could eventually be slave states. So he disliked it on that idea, but he also just disliked the idea of, starting a war. Technically, Mexico started the war, but President Polk kind of, slightly pushed them into this. So anyway, so Thoreau is definitely in the minority here as far as what popular opinion was at the time. Most people wanted, if not the actual war, they definitely wanted the expansion of the United States, and war seemed to be the only way to do it. So, okay. A nice little thing here. We are accustomed to say that the mass of men are unprepared, but improvement is slow because the few are not materially wiser or better than the many. It is not so important that the many should be as good as you as that there be some absolute goodness somewhere, for that will leaven the whole lump. I think he's quoting the Bible there, 1 Corinthians. And what he's basically saying right there is that just a little bit of basically this philosophy that he's saying that will change the mass of people's ideas overall. So, Great. Here's a little interesting thing that he says about voting. Again, this is really interesting to think about. Maybe true still. We're just, as I'm recording this in late October of 2024, just days away from presidential election. And he says all voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. So he's saying, like, even when you vote, based on your conscience, your morals, whatever, he says it's basically kind of like a little bit of a game, and the character of you as a voter is not staked. If I cast my vote, perchance as I think right, but I am not vitally concerned that the right should prevail. So he's basically saying, and you may disagree with this, it's really interesting. He's basically saying that just voting alone, he says there's so little value in it because what you're doing, it's more of just like a game. Like today, in 2024, approximately half the nation is Republican, approximately half the nation is a Democrat, or at least that's how the voting will be in the presidential election. And he basically says that just voting isn't really much of anything because it's basically like a game, like checkers or backgammon, and you think because of your own personal moral or ethical beliefs that you're doing something there. So again, you could disagree with that if you wanted to. Okay, this is beautiful. I don't think that you'll disagree with this at all. It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still have properly other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty at least to wash his hands of it, and if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support. So now why this is so important is because he and Emerson says similar things like this. Their idea is, first of all, and when we looked at Emerson's self-reliance, I pointed out, these passages which I enjoyed, which Emerson says, hey, you don't have to give to every charity or organization or, orphanage or poorhouse, basically any charity. He says, you don't have to give to all these charities. Are they my charities? Is it my responsibility to do this and that? And Thoreau is saying the very same thing here. But he says, before you can just go live your life and kind of turn your back on society if you want to, before you do that, you must make sure that your society is not, as he says, if I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must first see, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. I must get off him first that he may pursue his contemplations. So he's saying, whatever this weird thing is that we're all doing, this being a human being, trying to figure out what the meaning of life is, what do we want to do? He doesn't necessarily have a great answer for you, nor does Emerson, but what he is saying right here is that whatever you do, whatever mode of life you want to live, whatever's going to blow your hair back, before you do that, you've got to make sure that the society that you're a part of doesn't have slavery as a part of the society, because then you're stopping other people from living their own lives. So beautiful. He talks a little bit about how action, once you have figured out where you stand, basically, and then taking action, that is itself revolutionary. As he says there at the end of this little passage, that sort of thing, action from principle, not only divides states and churches, it divides family, it divides the individual, separating the diabolical in him from the divine. Good. This he is touching again on that initial metaphor about government being a machine and friction being bad policy. And so he touches on that here, and he says, he brings that up again. And then he says, if you need to, if you have to, if the injustice and the bad policies are so terrible that, as it says in the bottom part of this passage, if the bad policies are of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. So that's what he's trying to do here with what he spent his one night in jail and what he's trying to convince other people to do. stop giving in any way, not only to the federal government, to the government of Massachusetts, but you've got to do everything you can to stop slavery. Okay, good. Now let's, and when we look, kind of more of the same thing there, when we look back at the passages here, so we've gone through most of the things there. We're now down to point 6 where it says his prison experience. So we're going to take a look at that, and we'll finish up the passages that we're sort of analyzing and appreciating in just a moment. So let's do that now. This, one of the most beautiful, probably the single most beautiful paragraph in the entire essay. So let's take a look at this. And he just is gently getting into describing, what many of his townspeople knew, which was the truth that, remember, he's delivering this first as a speech in January of 1848. And about a year and a half before, he'd been put in prison for one night for failure to pay poll tax. And so now he's going to explain that. And, his townspeople knew that he had gone to Harvard. He was very intelligent. He was quite eccentric. Emerson was, by this time, a famous writer, and Emerson and Thoreau were great friends. But so he's going to describe this night that he spent in prison. And it's just beautiful what he says here. And it also is, we can take this as an understanding of what transcendentalism is, because transcendentalism is thinking of the human spirit and, in fact, our soul, which he and Emerson thought was immortal. The human soul is immortal, and that's always higher than anything that's on earth, any your physical body, any conditions which you might have to endure while you're here. I have paid no poll tax for 6 years. I was put into jail once on this account for one night, and as I stood considering the walls of stone 2 or 3 feet thick, the wood and iron a foot thick, and the iron grating which strained this light, I could not help being struck with the foolishness of that institution which treated me as if I were mere flesh and blood and bones. So it's really beautiful. What he's doing here is he takes the time to describe what jail is like physically, in order to laugh at the notion that anything that society can do can actually harm his spirit. I wondered that society should have concluded at length that this was the best use it could put me to, and had never thought to avail itself of my services in some way. I saw that if there were a wall of stone between me and my townsmen, there was a still more difficult one to climb or break through before they could get to be as free as I was. So it's just such a beautiful paragraph, because it flips the idea that freedom has anything to do with whether or not you're in prison. For him, they put him in prison and he feels more free. And he, in fact, makes fun of society for doing this. Going down just a little bit, he says, they... meaning, society, his townspeople, they plainly did not know how to treat me, but behaved like persons who are underbred. Then he goes to say that, it culminates rhetorically until he basically says that, society itself is, well, as Emerson said in Self-Reliance, society is a joint stock company with one thing that's trying to turn you into a conformist. So this is a little bit similar in that. Then he goes on to say a little bit further down here where my cursor is, as they could not reach me, they couldn't reach his body. They had resolved to, or they couldn't, as they couldn't reach his soul, they had resolved to punish his body, just as boys, if they cannot come at some person against whom they have a spite, will abuse his dog. I saw that the state was half-witted, that it was timid as a lone woman with her silver spoons, and that it did not know its friends from its foes, and I lost all my remaining respect for it, and I pitied it. This is just, it's incredible, because so again, this connects with the idea that this is all part of transcendentalism, as a body of work overall. Yes, it's describing the way he was put in prison. And then you go down a little bit later, and so, of course, he talks about his one night that he spent in prison. Well, it's just a county jail in his hometown, so it's not a big deal. Of course, it's not going to be, painful. Nothing really bad is going to happen. So, matter of fact, the first thing that he does here in this paragraph is describe how clean it is and how much he likes it. And, of course, he's such a minimalist basically in his life that the county jail, he's like, oh, it's so clean and enjoyable here. It's it really conforms to his ideas, like everything is functional, and so it's quite pleasant. His one fellow prisoner is a nice person who apparently accidentally burned down a barn and now has been thrown in prison for that. And then we skip down a little bit here, and now what's at the top of the page here? He says, I pumped my fellow prisoner as dry as I could. He, meaning he talked to him and asked him a million questions about what I guess prison life is like, blah, blah, blah. Because, Thoreau loved conversation, and so he's having a good time talking with this dude. Finally, they go to bed, and then, there it is, probably early evening, and he's in the town. Now, this is something that maybe you can understand if you grew up in a small town. Doesn't matter if it's, Concord in the 1800s or wherever you may have grown up, in the, 1900s or this century, depending on how old you are. But if you grew up in a small town, you know that town like the back of your hand. And now he's saying because he's in jail and the window is open, there's iron bars over the window so he can't escape, but the actual window has been lifted up so a breeze can come through and he can hear everything that's going on outside his window. And then he says it's so exotic and wonderful. Top of the page, it was like traveling into a far country, such as I had never expected to behold. To lie there for one night, it seemed to me that I had never heard the town clock strike before. For we slept with the windows open, which were inside the grating. It was to see my native village in the light of the Middle Ages, and our Concord was turned into a Rhine stream. Visions of knights and castles passed me by. They were the voices of old burghers. I was an involuntary spectator and auditor of whatever was said and done in the kitchen of the adjacent inn. So it gives him this new perspective, and really just beautiful writing. Of course, just to summarize things, the next morning when he gets up, the constable says, well, somebody paid your fine, so you're free to go now. So he didn't pay it. Probably it was his aunt. It was just a small fine. And so he's free and he goes on with his life. Okay, we're almost coming to the end of discussing the passages here in this. So now, after all of this, he talks about his prison experience, and now he's going to say basically, he's almost going to question himself. What he's going to do is he's going to say, am I taking things too far? So everything that's here in this pink area, which is probably page 916, he basically says, am I taking it too far? All of these problems that I'm sort of creating. I think sometimes why this people mean well, they're only ignorant. They would be better if they knew how. Why give your neighbors this pain to treat you as they are not inclined to? And then he goes on to say, skipping down to the next part that's highlighted there, you do not resist cold and hunger, the winds and the waves thus obstinately. You quietly submit to 1,000 similar necessities. You do not put your head into the fire. So he's saying to himself kind of out loud and rhetorically, hey, am I not taking things too far? There's all kinds of other things that I do, which are, troublesome. I have to, when he's basically saying, like, if I'm outside and it starts to rain, I don't shake my fist at the heavens and go, God, I don't want it to rain. Instead, you go indoors, right? If it's cold at nighttime, you either go indoors, or if you're camping like he would be sometimes, you build a fire. So he's saying, am I taking this all too far, But then he says in this third highlighted part, he doesn't really think that he is, because when he protects himself from the elements or doesn't put his head in a fire, when he does these things, it's because there's no other possibility, and the elements, which may be troubling him, the cold or the wind or the rain or anything, there's no way to change that, he says. But if I put my head deliberately into the fire, there is no appeal to the fire or to the maker of fire, and I have only myself to blame. So he's saying also there that he's when he's trying to change people's minds, it's not just that he's being obstinate. He's actually getting to them to change their mind because they have a maker. They have a creator. And so they should be pointed in, I think he's saying rather self-confidently, perhaps even arrogantly, that he needs to change people's minds, because if they do change their minds, then they're more in touch with their higher self, their maker, their creator. He doesn't say God, but it seems like that's close to what he's saying. Okay, great. Now, we're almost done with this. So remember, we already looked at the ending here, highlighted, in which I just want to point out that he is connecting back to the very first couple of lines, and he's talking about eventually, theoretically, human beings could get to a point where they don't even need a government. They could get to a state that is so glorious that they don't need a government anymore. So, but what we're going to look at is highlighted there in yellow, the last passage that we're going to look at. One of the most beautiful things there. And so, after his, description of the prison experience, he also talks a little bit about Daniel Webster, who was a Massachusetts senator, and he's basically, let's see if we have information there. He's, as I said, he's talking about Daniel Here we go. Daniel Webster, prominent Massachusetts Whig politician at the time a senator. So he's basically complaining about this person, Daniel Webster. And just to kind of understand this, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but Webster was, as it says, a Whig politician. He was a senator from Massachusetts, so he represents Thoreau in the U.S. Senate, and he was a very important politician. He was kind of like a Chuck Schumer would be today. That is, a very important politician on the left, on the progressive side. However, just as many people on the political left today might not like Chuck Schumer because they view him as too much of a centrist, even though he's a Democrat. In the same way, Thoreau is criticizing Webster, even though Webster claims to be anti-slavery. He makes so many concessions. And in fact, 2 years later, in 1850, in the Compromise of 1850, he'll help to give all kinds of compromises to the South. So anyway, there you go. Great. And so our last thing that we're going to look at is this passage, which is so beautiful. They who know of no purer source of truth, who have traced up its stream no higher, stand and wisely stand by the Bible and the Constitution, and drink at it there with reverence and humility. But they who would behold where it comes trickling into this lake or that pool, gird up their loins once more and continue their pilgrimage toward its fountainhead. So what this is one of the most beautiful and poetic passages, and what he's saying, if it's a little confusing, he's saying, the truth, whatever the truth with a capital T, I think. The truth with a capital T, like spiritual truths. Why are we here? How should we get along with other people? He's saying all of those things are in the Bible and in the U.S. Constitution. So he's complimenting the Bible and the U.S. Constitution. But he's also saying, well, we'll hold on to that for just a second, and then that'll be the basis of a writing assignment for you. So we'll just finish. So we went through all of these passages here, and then here is a clearer articulation on the bottom of this page. So you've seen everything on the top already. On the bottom of this is a clearer articulation of what is the thesis here. So the thesis of this overall speech and essay is that government should never be more authoritative than personal conscience. The essay also articulates his call for an immediate end to slavery in the Mexican War. So that is the final thesis of his speech/essay. Now, also what we'll do is, our final analysis and understanding of what transcendentalism is. I kind of teased this earlier. So now that we've read this, we've also read Self-Reliance and Nature and part of Walden. We've got our hands on 4 different texts by these two. What would be the sort of overall summary and significance? So at the bottom of the page here, it says, most of all, transcendentalism disregards external authority and tradition. So obviously in this essay, Thoreau he's tried to disregard external authority. In this essay, it's the state, right? In Self-Reliance, Emerson's external authority is society in general, which he is saying is always trying to conspire against you, basically. So also there are times in Emerson's Nature, for example, where he says we want to disregard the external authority of older philosophies, of scripture even. He says you can be a spiritual person. Maybe even Emerson thinks that you can, no, I'm sure that Emerson believes that you can be a Christian without adhering to the Bible. That's a revolutionary idea. And again, you may disagree with that. You may completely disagree with it, but it's a good way to sort of think about these bottom two statements, like what is transcendentalism about overall. So it disregards external authority and tradition, and it emphasizes intuition and direct experience. So again, in this essay that we just looked at in Resistance to Civil Government, the idea is that your conscience, that your intuition, that who you are as a person, that's what should be the emphasis. Now, Emerson will write about it in different but similar ways, we could say, in a really kind of new agey, weird way. Emerson in Nature says that when he's out in nature, he says, when I walk through the woods, I feel so wonderful, so glorious. He says, I feel the currents of the universal being circulate through me, and I am a part or particle of God. So again, this like direct experience of nature influences who yourself is. Also, to go on with Emerson, emphasizing intuition and direct experience, remember in Self-Reliance, he asks the question about 2/3 of the way through the essay. He says, after he's talked about the problem with conformity, the problem with self-consistency, the problem with organizations in general, then he says, he asks the questions. He says, what is the aboriginal self upon which all this is grounded? And then he says, it's spontaneity and instinct. And we talked about that in class already, how that seems kind of surprising. It's almost like too light. But then that's really what the idea for Thoreau and for Emerson is, that where is your sense of self coming from, your right and wrong, what you want to do, your belief in a higher power, all of that should be coming from your intuition and yourself, and also from your direct experience as well, rather than external authority and tradition. Great. So now what we're going to do is look at that one last time. And if you're one of my current students, you're going to be required to do a graded journal entry of 10 minutes stream of consciousness over this passage. So this passage, which is so beautiful, just wonderful. So, and by the way, if you're not one of my students and you feel like learning how to journal, there's a entire video about stream of consciousness journaling, which is wonderful. Read that or watch that if you want to. And then you'll know how to do stream of consciousness journaling. But anyway, if you're a current student, this passage, let's look at it again, and then I'll give you the journal prompt, and then obviously you do that on your own. So he says, they who know of no purer sources of truth, who have traced up its stream no higher, stand and wisely stand by the Bible and the Constitution. So what's he saying? That it's wise and intelligent to look at the U.S. Constitution and the Bible as sources of truth about how the world was created, why we're here, how we should interact with people, the 10 Commandments, all of these things in both the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, as well as in the Gospels. And then in the Constitution, he says, if you're looking for truth, wise people drink from it with reverence and humility. But then he says, of course, in a transcendentalist sort of point of view, the Bible and the Constitution were written by people, written by men. And he says, so then going on, he says, you can drink there and get truth. But they who behold where it comes trickling into this lake or that pool, they gird up their loins once more. Such a beautiful ending. And continue their pilgrimage toward the fountainhead. So then it's like he's inviting you, go ahead and look for it's kind of like, what is the meaning of life? He says, well, you can find some things about how to behave and how to live in the Bible and the Constitution. He likes them. He's not ever putting them down, but he's saying if you really want to go deeper, if you want to continue your pilgrimage, your journey, you'll look for it. And where does it? He doesn't know. He's inviting you to figure that out for yourself. So, okay, so let's finish this up, And again, if you're a current student, you'll be required to do a graded journal entry, 10-minute stream of consciousness writing on that passage. And the prompt is pretty simple. What does he mean by the fountainhead that is the purest source of truth? What does he mean by that? For those of you who are religious, do you feel that this is the same thing as God? If you're not religious, is there some source of ultimate spiritual knowledge? So again, if you're a current student, that's going to be a graded journal entry you have to do on your own, 10-minute stream of consciousness. Beautiful. Alrighty, people. Well, we have come to this the end of this, and if you're new here, somebody who just found my YouTube channel for some reason, thank you so much for stopping by my channel. Please consider liking, subscribing, sharing for more videos on literature and life.